Hey guys, I am Vishal and I welcome you all to this session by Edureka. Today, I am going to give you an overview of yet another Microsoft Azure certification. And today's topic of discussion is Azure 7535, which is the latest certification in this series. So in this session, we are going to take a look at various nitty-gritties of this particular certification. And by the time you're done with this session, I'm sure that you all would be having a very clear understanding as in what approach should you take in order to tackle or approach this particular certification. So let's not waste any time and quickly get started with today's agenda first. So what do we have here? Well, as far as this session goes, we are going to talk about what does this exam exactly cover and who are the people that should go ahead and take this particular examination. What are the exam basics and different exam topics? You would also understand what structured approach you should take in order to crack this particular examination or prepare for it better. Then I would give you a taste of Microsoft Azure concept, that is ARM, which is Azure Resource Manager. And I would also give you a short demo on this topic. I hope this agenda is clear to all of you guys. So let's move further and get started then. So what does this exam exactly cover? Now this exam is for people who have a clear understanding of how Microsoft Azure works. You should have experience in this domain and should have a clear understanding about how architecture works when we talk about a particular cloud platform. Now in Cloud 2, we have cloud architects who focus on designing various patterns or applications. Now, as a person who is appearing for this exam, you need to have that approach and understanding of those concepts as well. Now, as we move further, we would be discussing these topics in detail. For now, all you need to understand is you need to have a complete know-how from an architect's perspective when you do go ahead and approach for this particular examination. So who should take this exam? First of all, you should have good experience working with Microsoft Azure, and you should be willing to go ahead and take this particular certification examination. Next, you should have an understanding how an architect thinks in these situations. You need to have an understanding of various architectural styles. Now I'm referring to styles like your entire applications or maybe your monolithic applications, your microservices, which is a new approach towards software architecture. Now you should have an understanding of all these things and a desire to go ahead and learn how designing works. So if you have an interest in these things, then yes, this certification is for you as well. Do you need to have an understanding of coding and all those things? Well, for this exam, no, but this is not completely true. Even if you do go ahead and crack this exam, you need to understand you would be working with Azure platform. So you are expected to deal with various nitty-gritties of developing a particular software. Now, when I talk about a software, we are talking about different programming languages. Yes, you won't be coding, but you still need to understand what is working where and how. Say for example, when you talk about Microsoft Azure, many people have to go ahead and use something called as a PowerShell. Now it is not something that requires you to have rocket science knowledge of coding, but at least the basics as in how a PowerShell would work, what are the commands you need to use, how do you reach root directory, and where the problem is, all these things. So yes, some development background or implementation background if you do have, that would definitely help. It is not a mandate for this certification, but understanding definitely would hold you in a much better state. So it's your call to take, but I would suggest that you still try and prepare some basics about programming and all those things. Try to visit their website, try to understand what .NET framework is and what programming languages it basically supports. Because if you have an understanding of all those points, yes, again, this exam might seem little easier to you. So what are the exam basics that you need to focus on? First and foremost, you need to understand the duration of the exam, which is approximately 2 hours. As I've talked about previous certifications as well, these exams would last for around 2 hours. Now that is not certain. It can be less than that or more than that. What are the number of questions that you can expect in these exams or in this exam in particular? Well, you can expect somewhere around 60 questions. Again, it can be 50, it can be 45, or it can even be more than 60 because Microsoft Azure won't give you an exact number of the number of questions that are asked and neither the time duration for which you need to sit for the examination because the length and the number of questions varies, and based on the number of questions, the time for which you are going to sit in the exam also varies. So this is something that is not under your control and something you would not know from the very beginning. It's when you do go ahead and take your examination, you'd understand, okay, this exam is for this duration or this long. Languages in which you can take this exam. Unlike other certifications of Microsoft Azure, this is something that you can take only in English language. No, you cannot take it in any other language. There's no Russian this time. There's no Portuguese, no Chinese, just plain English. Yes, for certification 32 and 33, you did have this option of appearing for this exam in those languages, but for this one, it's only English. What are the number of points you need to score to clear this exam successfully? Well, the number of points is 700. Now, how do you score those 700? Again, it's a mystery. The way Microsoft Azure would grade you is different. Some questions might have 1 point, some might have 2 points. So do not think that you have 50 questions and you've cleared maybe 35 questions and you can be safe when you talk about clearing that exam. You might be, but that is not certain because the number of points a particular question has is something that varies. So be aware for this particular instance or this particular factor when you do appear for this exam. Exam fees. Now, depending upon the different geographical locations from where you're taking this exam, the price varies. Now, when we move to the website of Microsoft Azure, you can see what are the different prices in which you can take this exam. So meanwhile, you bear with me. What are the exam topics that you can expect? Now, I won't get into the details of these topics, but let's quickly walk through what is the weightage and what are the kind of topics you can expect. First and foremost, you need to have an understanding of how do you go ahead and design various compute infrastructures. Now, since we are talking about cloud computing, yes, you should have a knowledge of how computation works and how different compute services works when we talk about Microsoft Azure in particular. So you need to have an understanding of that as well. As far as the weightage goes, it is somewhere around 20 to 25%. You also need to have an understanding of how data works and how do you implement various operations that relate to data. This domain has somewhere around 15 to 20% of weightage. Networking is something that is very important when we talk about any certificate, when we talk about a particular cloud technology. Now, why? Because we are talking about a platform that works on network. So you need to have an understanding as in how these networks work, and accordingly there would be various concepts. If you do visit the website, you would be understanding these topics in detail as in what topic do you need to focus on. Security. We all know that Microsoft Azure takes security very seriously. There are more than 50 compliance programs when you talk about Microsoft Azure security. And there is something called as security development lifecycle, which exists throughout the lifecycle of Microsoft Azure applications. So you need to have a clear understanding of how this works and what approach would you take when you implement security for your particular application. And then the next module, which says that you should be able to design solutions using platform services. Now, Microsoft Azure would provide you with various services. Now, these services are many, more than 50 again, and you need to have a basic know-how all these services because that would be included in your exam in one way or the other. And then you should be good with operations as well. Yes, we are talking about networking, we are talking about architecting, deployment, and all these things. So you should have an understanding of how to operate with all these things and how a particular operations team would work. Because Microsoft Azure definitely supports DevOps, which is an approach where developers and operators or operational teams work together. So if you are planning to use that platform as well, so you need to have an understanding of those concepts as well. All you need to know is you need to have the basics of how are you going to go ahead and design particular solutions when you talk about it from an operations perspective, basically. So let's try to understand what are the types of questions that you can expect as far as this exam goes. Basically, there are three types of questions: your scenario-based questions, your standalone questions, and coding questions. Now, scenario-based questions are somewhere where you would be given a particular scenario and expected to write answers for the questions that correspond to these scenarios. If you have, say, maybe a 20-line scenario, you'd be having somewhere around 4 to 5 questions. So you need to answer those questions like we do for answer the questions for a particular passage when we talk about an English exam. But this would be more technical related questions. That is, a particular problem statement would be given to you with some conditions. And based on that, certain questions would be thrown at you and you need to go ahead and approach those questions. Then you have standalone questions where a particular problem statement is given and you are expected to generate a solution or select one of the solutions that is there in the options given to you. Coding questions. Again, I doubt you'd be having coding questions here, but the basic know-how would definitely help. How do you tackle these questions once they do appear in the exam? Let's try to discuss these one by one. Scenario-based questions. Now, these are lengthy questions. So you would have to go ahead and read those 20-30 lines, then go through the questions and answer those accordingly. Now, these questions will have quite a few distractions. So you need to be very specific when you read these paragraphs. Try to make sure that you read them very quickly and focus on important points and accordingly try to relate those questions. Now, what approach do I take in these situations? If you ask me, I would first read the questions as in, okay, these are the questions, and then try to read the paragraph quickly because that would give me an idea, okay, this is the keyword I read. So this might be the nearest answer to it, or this is where I can actually figure out an answer. So this is one approach you can take. You can always go back and forth, but you need to understand one thing. Once you do submit the answers, then making changes to them is difficult. So read them quickly, try to do it the other way around, be specific, and stay aware of various distractions that are there in this exam or in these questions rather. Then we have the standalone questions. These are comparatively easier. You'd be having a particular problem statement and you need to just go ahead and give the solution. So the options, as far as the various options you have when you pick an answer, those might be a little confusing, but comparatively these are easier because you have only one problem statement and few options to choose from. Just make sure that you take care of time here, because time can be a problem since you do not know how much time you have. You need to approach these questions quickly. Plus, try to make sure you attempt all these questions because there is no negative marking for any of these questions. Overall difficulty. Now, when we talk about overall difficulty, you need to understand these points as well. One, are you a developer or not? If not, I would suggest that you get an understanding of how few programming languages work and how can you deal with certain problems logically. Yes, people do have a good logic, but if you do have a programming experience, you know how to tackle various problems when you talk about a particular approach towards coding and architecting software. So yes, little bit of programming won't harm you definitely. So I would suggest that you go ahead and understand these things as well. So if you are a developer, you might be in a much better position to actually go ahead and take this examination. If not, you still would be in a good position, but just to be safe, I would suggest that get a little bit of understanding of these concepts as well. Networking experience is a must because we are talking about a cloud platform, and I already talked about this point. More than 50% of the questions are scenario based, and again, you need to focus on those and manage your time in a much better way. Plus, understanding of these languages, which are your .NET framework. We are talking about programming languages like your Visual Basic. We have your C Sharp or C hash basically. So you need to have an understanding of how these programming languages work and how Microsoft Azure supports these programming languages as well. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm quickly going to switch into the Microsoft Azure page and see if we have missed out on any points. And once we do that and get a basic know-how of what are the few basics that your exam expects you to have, I would also talk about what resources to refer and what approach to take to clear this exam. And after that, I would again switch back to the presentation and we can have a discussion on ARM as I promised. So let me quickly switch to the so-called website of Microsoft Azure. So yes, I've gone ahead and I've switched into the Microsoft website. Now this page in particular talks about the details of this particular examination. Now we have already covered most of the points that are there here, but I still wanted you to have a look at it. A quick look would definitely help us a little more. Now, as you can see, this exam is for IT professionals in particular, and the language in which you can take this exam is English only. Now, this is the fees when you appear for this examination from United States. If you're not from here, you can always click here and select the region from which you want to take the exam. Now, if I just switch and I see certain name, say I pick maybe France, the fees is 165 euros. So you're free to go ahead and see whether your region is eligible for this exam, and if so, what is the fees and what is the currency in which you're supposed to pay that particular fees. Now, certain countries, they support paying fees only in USDs, that is US dollars. So you need to verify that what currency do they take and what is the amount of fees that you need to pay for this particular certification. You can come here and schedule this particular examination, but I won't click here and get into the details. It is a simple process. You can just go ahead and choose that. Let's quickly move down and see what it has to offer to us. See, these are the domains which I talked about. When you click on these, you have the detailed explanation, as in the VM deployments, your dev test labs and everything. As in, what does this exam exactly cover? You're designing solutions for your VMs, that is virtual machines. You're dealing with serverless computing and all these topics. Now, if you do click on these things, you'd be having a complete understanding as in what is expected out of you, even as a somebody who has worked in operations and all those things. How do you prepare for this particular examination? Now, you need to understand one thing. As far as your approach is concerned, you need to give yourself somewhere around 2 to 3 months. Now that varies from person to person, but that is the general idea. You need to have an understanding of Microsoft Azure. I would give you a suggestion. You come here, log into this website and use the free services where a free credit is given to you, which you can use. You can exhaust all the credit. You just need to come here and create your account. Once you do that, try understanding all these services that Microsoft Azure has to offer to you. And how do these services work and what do they do exactly? Once you do have this understanding, next what you can do is use YouTube, free resources that you have. Start by understanding how Microsoft Azure works and what are the applications or implementations that YouTube has to offer to you, or various people who have worked on these things. What do they have to offer to you? Once you have that understanding, then again, I would suggest you visit the community of Microsoft Azure. Now, there are quite a few documentations here, and every topic is given a clear explanation as in what do you need to do and what practical approach you need to take. After that, you also have certain books and resources which you can refer. I won't get into the details of those. Come here and visit this page. You'd get the resources as well. But for now, start by understanding how Microsoft Azure works. Next, visit YouTube. Try to understand what different people have to say about it. Don't try to get into too much details because people have this tendency of confusing others, but too much can be too bad here. But instead, I would say is still take a particular approach and try to learn as much as you can. And once you have an understanding of all these things, as in once you've understood what people have to say, how YouTube works, how Azure is portrayed there, once you have a clear hands-on on how Microsoft Azure works, once you've worked on this so-called platform, then you'd be in a much better state to take a call by yourself, as in do you need further coaching? If you do, Microsoft Azure would provide you with coaching as well. There is online training, instructor-led training here, and then you have your practice tests. Now these are must because these help you plan much better. How? Once you've understood everything and learned everything, once you do give these exams, you'd understand how good you are. And let me tell you one thing, these exams are just 80% of what you can expect in the main exam. Yes, these exams make it feel that, okay, you're doing pretty good. But when you do go to the exam, there is this added exam pressure. Plus, you might have certain questions which are difficult than what you had in these practice exams. So take them as a reference and a benchmark of 80%, expecting that you might come across questions which are difficult than what you've learned here. So be prepared for that as well. Next, make sure you plan your studying properly. First 1 month, I would say that you give it to exploring, try to understand the platform, try to go through all the resources I told you to, and then take a structured approach where you actually go ahead and prepare these topics serially and work on as many projects or as many concepts and applications as you can. Stay connected to the community. Then in last 1 month, start taking the examination where in first 10 days, you take a couple of exams and then you know, okay, this is where I stand. Again, prepare accordingly and then go ahead and take the certification examination. And I'm sure that you all would be in a very good state to go ahead and crack this particular examination. If you're somebody who's interested in maybe taking a structured training or something like that, you can definitely visit this website, that is Edureka. Now, this website has all the Microsoft Azure courses, your 732, 733, and even 735. They have a proper structured approach where all the courses are in line with the certification course or the certification syllabus rather. And then you can go ahead and avail their services at a very cheaper rate. What this website or the people who manage this website do is they provide you with proper online training where you can go ahead and take a certification course by sitting at home. You do not have to visit any classroom. They have dedicated teachers who have experience of more than 10 to 15 years in the domain. So yes, that is an added advantage. Apart from that, they have a 24/7 service team, which actually corresponds to all your queries if you have any. Even technical support is provided to you in case if you miss out on any concepts and you're having trouble implementing something, definitely the query would be resolved by these people. Apart from that, you have access to something called as LMS, which is Learning Management System, and you have an access to this for your lifetime. That means if you assign for a particular course, you can actually go ahead and avail or take a view at all the resources that you've used, plus even the recorded lectures. And even if this course is discarded or you are not a part of this course anymore, this LMS would stay in your system, or you can always log into Edureka's website and you'd be having access to that LMS, which gives you all the resources throughout your life, even after the course is scrapped. So yes, this is what you have. And if you're interested in a structured approach, this might definitely not be a bad option for you. But then that is up to you. My first suggestion would be you do go ahead and research for all the topics, prepare them well, and I'm sure that you all would be in a very good state to go ahead and crack this particular examination. We are going to take a look at what Microsoft Azure Resource Manager is, that is ARM. Well, we all know that we have a cloud platform on which we would be having various virtual machines, applications working together, and various other components. Now, these can be individual entities, but when you look at it from an architect's perspective, you need to have an understanding of them working together. So you need something that orchestrates all these applications or these components together. Now that something is nothing but your ARM, that is Azure Resource Manager. What it does is it helps you combine or relate all these interdependent parts into one entity. Plus, it lets you manage various resources. It lets you work with a particular approach and find solutions for these things. Like you can go ahead and you can test your applications, you can manage them, you can create resources, you can delete those, and n number of other operations. Plus, what it does is it gives you various templates that let you perform certain tasks that you predefine. If you need a particular approach towards solving a particular problem or taking care of a particular problem, then you can define your requirements as in this is what you need, and your ARM basically would carry out all those applications. That means you would be templatizing a particular solution and ARM would execute that particular solution. So what are the components when we talk about Azure Resource Manager? Well, first of all, we have resources and resource group. Now, a resource is nothing but a single entity that resides on your cloud platform. Now, that can be anything, as I've already mentioned. It can be a VM, it can be a particular storage entity or something like that. Now, when you talk about a resource group, we are talking about these resources combined. That means a resource group would hold certain resources in it. These resources are something that should be able to relate to each other, and they should have a lifespan of one single life cycle. Suppose my application has a life cycle of so many things or maybe n number of things. So all the resources that correspond to a particular resource group that is taking care of that application, they all should have a similar lifeline or a lifetime. So yes, this is what a resources and resource groups are. Then you have something called as a resource provider. Now resource provider is nothing but a service. Now as I've already mentioned, Microsoft Azure has more than 50 services. There are quite a few compute services, storage services, database services. Now, entities that are generated by using these services are called as your resources, and these services which provide you with those resources are called as your resource providers. You also have something called as a resource manager template. Now, it is nothing but again a template that would help you perform predefined tasks. And then you have something called as declarative syntax. Now, these declarative syntax help you prepare these templates. They're basically built in JSON, that is your JavaScript file basically, which deals with these kind of templates. And using your declarative syntax, you can actually go ahead and build these resource manager templates as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to again switch into Microsoft Azure. So yes guys, what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've logged into my Azure account. We are now going to go ahead and take a look at a small demo that talks about all the points which we just discussed, like what a resource manager is and why is it needed. We also learned or studied what a resource group is and what are containers and all those things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a resource group, and then I'm going to add a storage account to it. Once I do that, I'll tell you what these things are. And we are also going to go ahead and add some storage resources to it as well. Now, for people who are completely new to Microsoft Azure, this is how the portal looks like. Now, if you do want to go ahead and use all these things, what you need to do is you have to go ahead and create a Microsoft Azure account. They would give you some free credits, which you can actually use. That means for those credits, you actually have a free usage of Microsoft Azure. Now, there are certain services that have particular credit limits. You cannot exceed those. And if you do exceed those limits, you would be charged accordingly. But that is a lengthy process. If you want to go ahead and start, I would suggest that you do go ahead and create this account. The fact that you are here for this certification, I believe that you all know that, or I assume that you all have an account already. If not, I would suggest that you all go ahead and create this account and we can get started then. Okay, so the topic which we just spoke about, most of those topics would be concerned to module 2 as far as your this certification goes. That means all the questions that would be asked to you would more or less fall in the module 2 or module 3 if I'm not wrong. I'm talking about a concept that is in the interim, but I just wanted you to have a taste of it, as in what are the concepts and what are those things. So I randomly picked up a topic and we are having a discussion on that. So let us move further and try to go ahead and create a so-called resource group. Now, as you can see, this is the interface. Here you can directly click and create a resource group or a resource basically. You have all the options. You can go ahead and create a VM as well, but we are not doing that for now. I am more concerned about creating a resource group. So if I'm not wrong, there's an option here where you can just go ahead and select a resource group or create one. If you click here, you have this option. It would show you all the existing resource groups. Before that, let me just go back and show you something else. Yeah, this is the dashboard. Now, when you do create all the resources and stuff, you have an option of pinning that to your dashboard. A dashboard is nothing but a place where you can actually go ahead and see the work you have done, and you can pin your work there in the form of tiles, just as we do on our notice boards and all those things. So if you want something that you can access quickly, you can just go ahead and put it on your dashboard. Or having said that, let's move back to our resource groups. I can click here and I would be having all the resource groups that have been created with their location, as in where are they created. So let us go ahead and create one, say add. And once I do that, I have an option of entering in details here. Now I need a name for my resource group. Let's call it sample RG for Azure 7535. Let's see whether it takes in this name or not. Subscription is Azure here, and say the resource group location is South India. It does not bother me a lot. You can choose any other regions if you want. You have an option to do that. I'll stick with this region only, and I would say create. And there you go. My resource group is created. You can just directly pin it to the dashboard if you want to, or you can actually go ahead and visit the resource group there and there. Let's say pin it, and it's pinned to my dashboard. Now I can come here and search for the resource group. The name was sample RG for Azure 7535 is the name. You can click on it and you can open it. And there you go. You have the details, as in you have a resource group and the subscription ID and all those things. What you can also do is you can go ahead and create a storage account. Now, this is nothing but a namespace basically that lets you have a storage account. Without a storage account, you cannot go ahead and do all these things. So once you have a storage account, you can assign a resource group to it. And then you have a proper storage where you can put in all the files and all the containers you want to, or more or less a container for where you can just put in your data or dump your data basically. So yeah, that is what a resource group does, and that is what a storage account also does. It lets you have or hold a particular resource group in it. So it is more or less a namespace basically. So if I'm here, I'm going to click on add, and I'm going to give it a name, say, so you can have only lower cases here. So I've given it a name, and I'm going to select the classic deployment model. Yes, we would be deploying a resource group basically. So I select classic. Storage account again is classic. Location is given. Now I have these options here. Technically, there are three options. You have your locally redundant storage. Now, for people who are completely new to this topic, let me tell you that what we do is, in order to keep our data secure, or in order to be able to recover that data, you always need to have replications of your so-called data. That means if I'm having, say, 10 GB of data and I need to use it in a particular way, there's a possibility that if something happens at my location where the data is stored, I might lose that data. So what I do is I go ahead and I replicate this data and have multiple copies of this data so that I can store it somewhere else. In case if one of my data goes or there is some hardware failure, I can always have a replicated copy somewhere else which I can use. Now, based on this replication method, we have quite a few types in which you can actually go ahead and replicate your data. Now, these are those types. First and foremost, you have your read access geo-redundant storage. You also have something called as your locally redundant storage, geo redundant storage, and this thing. So what are all these things? Well, first and foremost, if you select this is what I'm going to select because it is the cheapest one, but that does not matter because all we are doing is creating a sample here. Let me start by talking about this thing. Now what this thing does is it creates all the copies at one place in one data center basically. That means you'll be having 3 copies and those would be at the very same place. So the problem is if something goes wrong with the complete location where you've stored the data, everything would get wiped out and you might be at a risk of losing your data. So normally what people do is they replicate certain kinds of data only. They replicate that kind of a data which can be easily recreated, or in case if there are certain government policies saying that, okay, you should not have your data at a location which is not in this country or not in this region. For such government policies, you can actually go ahead and replicate your data here. But comparatively, it is little riskier to have a locally redundant storage than the other storage options that you have. But again, it is cheaper than the other ways of storing your data. Next you have is your geo-redundant storage. Now, this is something that lets you store your data at multiple regions. You can have a copy at one region, which is your primary copy, and then you can have another copy at some other region, which is maybe say one copy is in South India, which I just did. You might have one copy in West US. So you actually have an access to both the copies. That means if one of the copies fails or one of the data centers goes down, you always have a backup copy somewhere else. You also have something called as read access geo-redundant storage, that is RAGRS. What does that mean is when you do create these replicas, you are creating a copy at one place. That copy is getting copied at some other region where an LRS is taken, that is locally redundant storage is taken, and multiple replicas are created in that other region as well. So if one of the region fails, you always have a secondary region for accessing this data. And this is only read access. That means you can only have a reading access to the secondary data. So you need to keep that in mind as well. So geo redundant is costlier than the locally redundant storage, but it is also safer than the first option, which I just talked about. So yeah, These are the options which you can actually go ahead and use to store your data. For now, I'm going to go ahead and select this, the basic one. I say the standard performance. Now there is something called as a premium performance as well. To give you a small idea about it, there are certain ways of storing your data or using certain resources in which you get high performance. Suppose I need VMs only. In that case, I can go ahead and pick this premium option where I can have virtual machines which give me optimized or high performance when needed. For now, we do not need that, so just stick to the standard one. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select this, use existing, because we have our sample resource group, and that is this, and I say create. So the deployment is in progress. Now it might take a while before the deployment does happen because it can be a lengthier process, and at times even the type of connectivity or internet you have, it can slow down the process. So yeah, that does happen. So once we do have a resource group, we can actually go ahead and add a container to it, or maybe even a blob storage. Blob storage is nothing but a type of a storage. Now Microsoft Azure gives you various options to store your data. You have a storage in which you can typically store your standard structured data, that is for your tables and all those things. Plus there is something called as an unstructured data. Now we are talking about blob storage. It basically holds in binary files or maybe even unstructured data. Now that is what a blob storage is for. So what we are going to do is we are just going to go ahead and create a blob storage. We won't be using it to hold some unstructured data, but just to give you a demo, I would be going ahead and creating a blob storage as well, where we can go ahead and add a CSV file just to see whether a container or a storage is created properly or not. So yeah, that is something that we would be doing. But for that to happen, I need to have my so-called deployment completed. So yeah, the deployment has succeeded now. There was a problem while I was doing this. It took a very long while for this deployment to complete. And when I tried refreshing it, it gave me an error saying that your deployment could not be completed. So I had to go ahead and redeploy the same thing again. I've just made a slight change to it. I've changed the name from SAMP1 to SAMP11, and I've repeated the same process, as in I've gone ahead, I've given in the name, and I've selected a resource group where I can actually go ahead and have the storage account. So yep, the process is done now. I can just click on this thing to go to the resource, or as always, I can come here and I can select the same thing. There you go. Let me just minimize this. So we have this, the option as in what services do I want? Do I want tables to be added to it, queues, files, and all those things? Or can I just go ahead and create a blob? So if I click on this, this is something that would open. Yeah, I have an option of adding a container here. So I say add it, name, maybe say temp. And I have an option to select, as in you can select all these things, as in what kind of access do you want? Do you want a blob here? Do you want a plain container here? Now talking about access, I just remembered one thing. Even while creating your so-called replications, which we just discussed a while back, you need to understand something called as SLAs, that is your service level agreements. Now I won't get into the details of these topics, but yeah, there are certain rules which you have, and if you follow those rules, you can have proper applications and all those things. So yep, for people who are interested can go into details of those topics, but that is not important for now. For now, I'm just going ahead and creating a container basically. So I click on OK. And as you can see, a container is created successfully. Now this is something that happens very quickly. My deployment took a very long time. This does not. And you can see there is a temporary container here. I can just go ahead and add a blob as well. Now let me name it say temp2, and I say a blob. Okay. And as you can see, we have a so-called blob created as well. Now that we have a blob here, let's try to add a file to it. Say I have this blob here. I open it. And can I just go ahead and upload a file to it? Say I need to pick some CSV file. So where do I select a particular file? I go back to one of my folders, and here is this credit card transaction thing which I can actually go ahead and use. So I have this CSV file here and I say upload. It is a 1 MB file if I'm not wrong. Let's see whether it gets uploaded or not. The internet is fairly slow today, so these things are taking a lot of time. So I had trouble actually going ahead and deploying my applications too. But as you can see now that the file has been uploaded, and so yeah, there you go. I've actually gone ahead and created a proper storage, and I've uploaded a file there as well. So this is more or less of it, as in this is how you work with all these things. That is, you can go ahead and have a resource manager which takes care of all the resources. You can create a resource group, have a storage account, and then you can go ahead and have your containers where you can put all your files, create replications, and all those things. And Microsoft Azure lets you do all these things at a mere click. There is a lot more to explore when you talk about Microsoft Azure, and there is a lot to learn as well. So I would highly recommend you go ahead and start exploring how Microsoft Azure works and try to go through all these concepts. These are fairly easy to pick up if you are somebody who's interested in all these things, and I'm sure that all these topics would definitely keep you intrigued. So as far as this session goes, these are the topics I wanted to talk about and wanted you to have an idea about these things. If you do have any query on these topics and you feel that I need to answer those, you can put those queries in the comment section below and I would be more than happy to get back to all of you. As far as this session goes, I would be resting it here and here. Thank you. Bye bye.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!